Hello? Is this microphone working? It, can you hear me at the back? At the back row, can you indicate that you can hear me? No, you can't hear me. Can you hear me right at the back? Can you hear me, or do we need to turn up the microphone? Is it okay? I want the people at the back to nod. Good, okay, thank you. Right, this is the Symposium Developing Student Feedback Literacy in Higher Education. If we'd have held this 2 years ago, then not many people would be playing in this little patch of the woods. But now it seems it's quite widespread. So what today is a collection of papers which both talk about some research in that area and some applications in that area. And what I'd like to do just before I introduce each paper is just to give a wee bit of an introduction about feedback. So we've seen over the last few years a shift in thinking about feedback. And that shift in thinking about feedback has moved from seeing feedback as inputs, which may or may not have an effect, to processes which students necessarily need to go on in order to make a difference to their learning. And it's interesting if you do the Google search on interest in what is feedback over time, it's definitely on an upward trajectory, which as a researcher is just where you want to be, right? You do not want to be on a downward trajectory in Google. Oh, maybe somebody disagreed there. Okay, we are in general agreement that improving feedback comments won't necessarily improve student feedback literacy because they don't speak to student feedback literacy by and large. And we need to focus on feedback literacy because if students play a significant role in feedback processes, they need highly developed feedback literacy in order to cope well in that environment. That's why we're bothered with this topic. And maybe not the other speakers, but I'm taking the definition of feedback literacy from the Carless and Bowd sort of definition. So that's by way of preamble. I'd like to move on to the first paper, and my co-authors, except one, Anastasia is in the audience, I hope. Anastasia, you hiding? This is terrible, because I'm going to be presenting a paper in which I'm the least equipped person in the whole team to talk about the psychometric properties of the scale. Okay, so maybe I'll stop you asking questions about that. So I want to talk about the development of a scale. So why do we need a feedback literacy scale? Because if we're in the business of promoting students' feedback literacy, we need to see whether it's changed from one state to another, and we need to track them over time. Do students improve through interventions that help, or do they not improve through interventions that help? Will students develop feedback literacy without anything that we do or not? To do all that, we need to be able to measure it. Now, taking the conceptualizations that came in that earlier paper, we started to focus on these 4 key areas. So our conceptual framework was based upon this: appreciating feedback, making judgments, managing affect, and taking action. And we developed our own framework for the scale, which basically took those 4 elements and added one more from the Malloy empirical analysis of accounts of feedback. And the one that we added was the provide feedback information, and it's about acknowledging feedback as a reciprocal process. Now, as I'll come on to in a minute, that caused us some problems, because some people do not believe it's a reciprocal process. So we'll come to that. So this is how the two mapped on. So we developed a scale based upon the concepts on the left, interpreted through what had been written before. So we generated 45 questions initially, spread over those 5 concepts. We had it in the form, please think about what you usually do in your studies and rate how often you do these things, 6-point Likert scale. Workshopped it through 3 iterations and then sent it out to 21 feedback experts. I put feedback experts in inverted commas here because there wasn't consensus about what feedback was amongst the feedback experts. And each one of those experts rated each question on how essential they believed it to be, and they commented on wording issues. So we had 39 revised questions. We reviewed them with another 8 experts. We dropped out 5 and modified another 7. Now, what are the unique features of this particular instrument compared with others? Because there's others out there, which I won't talk about because you might be driven to these others, which obviously aren't as sound as the one I'm talking about here. Well, first of all, they were derived from this conceptualization of feedback literacy. We absolutely bent over backwards to avoid the word feedback in the items because we know the word feedback is ambiguous. Students have different interpretations of feedback, and a lot of students believe feedback is only the comments teachers provide. So we had to kind of wash our mouths out. We operationalise the items in terms of what learners do, because if we're measuring learners' capability, we need to focus on their interpretation of their actions. We try to avoid words that are associated with a particular educational level, because we had aspirations to use this both in schools, higher education, and the workplace. We've only validated it in higher education, so the other two are aspirations. And some of the items in the provide feedback information category, as I mentioned, were initially rated as not essential because it wasn't a part of their conceptualisation of feedback literacy. Offering oneself to another student, for some people, isn't in the feedback business. Now, I'm not going to go through the scale itself. This is what it finally looks like. So if you actually have any questions about what's on the scale, then I can refer back to that. So we tried it out on 350 university students with those age ranges, that mix from Australia, Ireland, New Zealand and UK. So first part of the analysis was confirmatory factor analysis, and overall the fit between the data and the hypothesised model was fine. There's a very low factor rating on 2 of the items in the target. The first one being when I comment on someone's work, I consider the emotional impact of my comments. And when making sense of comments, I try not to focus on the time and effort I put into the work. So they didn't rate very highly on these factors. And some items cross-loaded on different factors. And particularly this one, and I felt comfortable commenting on other people's work. So we removed the questionable items one by one on the basis of the item analysis and the modification indices. And we ended up with these 5 items through to the subscales and with an acceptable model fit. And then although 2 of these items, the seeking feedback and understanding feedback, was high, we decided to keep them both in because purely pragmatically they lead to different kind of actions on the basis of what someone might do. We also did a Roush analysis which didn't result in the exclusion of any items or changes in our factor structure. We did test-retest, which we found to be acceptable. And we looked at external validity where we administered both our scale and the Big 5 to the group of students, and we found these correlations. And as you might expect, there are correlations. Surprise, surprise. But as a non-psychologist myself, I have to admit that I'm not quite so interested in things you can't intervene in and change. But I'm sure the psychologists in the audience will jump all over me for that. So what we want to report here is that we think we've got an important step forward with a more robust quantitative research on feedback literacy. We don't here compare this with the other scales, but I'm sure we will have something to say about that in the future. And we need to resolve this issue more generally in our community about whether the capability of providing feedback information to another person is or is not a part of feedback literacy. I'm in the camp where it is in. Some people are in the camp where it's out. So we need to look at that as well. So, if you want to get hold of it, this has been held up for over a year by a journal. I was going to say whether a journal should remain nameless or not, but I'm going to out them. Studies in higher education has been in a state of chaos for the last year, so be very, very careful about submitting things to that journal until the new editor is in post, because they've been sitting on papers and doing very silly things with papers, including sitting on this for a year without movement. So, thank you very much for your attention. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each paper presenter to come up in turn. They present their paper. We won't have any immediate discussion. After all the papers, Rochelle will be a discussant and come up and make some comments, and then we'll have some open discussion. So I'm just going back to the first one with the list of papers. So the next presentation is by Claudia and Renska, who are doing a double act.
So let's check first. If you can clearly hear me, can you raise your hand? Oh, that's all the way to the back. We're going to try this without a microphone. Right? Yep. Okay. Let's see. Here it is. The slides coming up. So my name is Claudia Tielemans. I'm a physician and a PhD student, and I'm here with educational researcher Renske de Klein. Sorry, I just started the introductions.
No, that's good.
With me. But thank you very much, Dave. Very eager to begin.
Good.
There. Okay, so that's us. We work at the University Medical Center Utrecht in the Netherlands, and we're happy to share some work we've been doing with you today about healthcare students' goal setting for their interprofessional feedback literacy. Now, so we work in a medical center, and you may or you may not know this, but in healthcare it's becoming increasingly important to train professionals as members of interprofessional teams. Make sure they can work and learn interprofessionally, really. Now, whether you are undergraduate, postgraduate, or even just a lifelong learner, both interprofessional collaboration and learning require feedback. Surprise. And so it's a big aim in health professions education to train its students as givers and users of feedback in their interprofessional workplace dialogues. However, that's more easily said than done, because that interprofessional context in healthcare gives us some very significant barriers to feedback engagement. So I'm going to give the word to Renske.
So Tineke Westerveld, her dream was, and her assignment to us as a team, to first design a rubric for feedback skills. But along the way we decided not to do so, but we did make a framework. She didn't make it to see the final version of it, and that's why we named it after her, the Westerveld framework, and we show her picture on every presentation. That we'll do afterwards. But what we did was we followed the work on feedback literacy. I see I quoted a different sentence from the paper of Carles and Boud. And I think the framework shows our cards, our colors, in what camp we are in terms of the providing feedback. Because we wanted to include all feedback skills that those health professionals are going to be needing. And that will be both giving feedback and asking for feedback and using feedback. So we try not to refer to it as the feedback receiver any longer, but the feedback user, to imply this active role. But then the framework was there with two sides of it. So with both this one. So with both what the giver does in a feedback dialogue, in an interprofessional feedback dialogue, and what the information user does in this dialogue, mapped on the same 7 criteria for this interprofessional dialogue. And what we found in the framework was that there are some interprofessional barriers, actually. So if you want to have this feedback dialogues with someone from another profession, it gives extra barriers than you can already experience with mono-professional settings. Well, we made an infographic of the framework, and it can be found, but we needed it to share it with you because we've used it in our education. So in an interprofessional setting with both nursing and medical students, we had a 2-day training on interprofessional feedback. And as you can see, we included both lectures in these training days as well as active learning formats in which students were discussing examples, were practicing role-playing. But then there's the thing that happened in the classroom, and they will be in the workplace in their rotation then to apply it. And in order to bridge that gap, we made an individual goal setting assignment. So at the end of this 2-day training, we asked these students to set their personal goals for their feedback skills based on the Westerveld framework. I'll tell you a bit more about it in a minute. But what we find important to note is that we also use the work of David Nicol on internal feedback to explain why we chose the goal setting assignment. Because we think this is what he defined to be internal feedback. So what we wanted is that students created a new insight, which would be their personal goal, an internal product, in which they compare their current knowledge, so their self-assessment, if you will, to some reference information. And that was our intention of the Westerveld framework, that would be the reference information. But just a warning sign that we have in our conversations within our team. So we use the work of David Nicol to think about feedback goals. Not the feedback conversation, but how students set their own goals for their feedback skills. So it is kind of a meta perspective there. And we sometimes lose it as well in our own discussions. So our research questions were, what kind of feedback goals do these students set for themselves, and how do they set them for themselves? Because it can provide us insight in how they try to bridge that gap from theory in the classroom to practice in the workplace. How do we do so? Well, the goal setting assignment have these 3 components. So we ask them, in which feedback role, as we described it in the Westerveld framework, do you think you need to learn the most? Would that be as a feedback giver or as a feedback user? And on what criterion do you see yourself improve the most? And then set a specific goal. And how do we analyze that? We aimed to focus, because of time issues, on B and C here. So we're going to share with you the criteria that they tapped for themselves, and we analyzed the goals on the content and also on the specificity. So how specific is that goal that they set? And just to give you an idea, there were over 1,000 students, and even though it was in the training, we only received 288 assignments with only 185 goals. But this data is to answer the question, what type of feedback goals do students set for themselves? But we had this second research question, how, by which processes? And therefore we held 3 focus groups with students, both nursing students and medical students. And in the first part, we had an open discussion with them, like what kind of goal did you set for yourself? And in the second part, we listed some reference information for them to ask them more specifically, did you use the Westerveld framework? Did you use earlier experiences? Things that we generated based on the work of David Nicol and Locke and Latham in terms of goal setting. And we analyzed them on how they used these sources, but we also looked at the focus group data to see were there any other themes that we hadn't thought about beforehand. Then the results.
Yes. So obviously we have a lot of results, and we made a selection to present to you here. So I want to start with that second question of the goal setting assignment. So on what Westerveld criterion do you aim to improve in your next rotation? And as you can see in the graph behind me, the largest group of answers were that they wanted to improve the actionability of their feedback dialogue. There's a lot of interesting other things here, but you can ask questions if you want about them later. Because it gets really interesting when we go to the next question, which was please set a goal for your next rotation. And though they intend to work on the actionability of their dialogue, what you see when we as a research team encode the content of the goals they subsequently set is that by far the largest group was addressing the criterion open and respectful, which baffled us so much that we decided to subcode those and see what kinds of goals were students setting within that category. And then you could see that these goals were mostly about being more assertive and giving feedback, followed at some distance by being more open to feedback. So an example of a goal that would have been encoded as being about open and respectful and assertiveness would be to stand up for myself and to dare to start dialogues with doctors, set by a nursing student. Now, like I said, we also, or like Renske said, we also encoded them for specificity. And here you can see the results of that. So by far, most students really set quite poorly specific goals. So an example is on the slide, to give and receive more feedback. That was a goal a student set. And most goals were like that one, actually. And only about 2% of the goals that we encoded, we deemed as having good specificity. Now, aside from analyzing these goals, we also held focus groups, like Renske said. And it's quite good to note, probably in the first discussion, the open discussion, we already saw the following sources of data that students use, or the sources of information that students use as they were describing their goal-setting process, which were previous experience in workplace rotations, the Westerveld framework, personal characteristics, and outcome expectations. And to give you some feeling of how they use these sources, this student says, for me it's more the role of feedback receiver in which I can learn more, and then specifically open and respectful because I'm not so good at that. So we would have, we encoded this as a student describing using the Westerveld framework, so the criterion and the receiver role, and her personal characteristic of self-efficacy. And another example is this one, where a student says, sometimes it can be quite difficult to raise your voice in such situations with the gynecologist, for instance. They are the chief, after all. So this is a student, in our view, describing an expectation of hierarchy in her future rotations and as a barrier to her feedback process based on previous experience in her workplace rotations with the gynecologist. Okay, thanks. And that was actually something we saw quite a lot in that group. So the outcome expectations were mostly about barriers they expected to encounter in practice based on what they had seen in their previous rotations. And those were mostly expected hierarchy, but also expecting a lack of interprofessional contact, lack of time, and hindering assessment practices. Now, aside from these groups, we also saw in our focus groups that as students were talking about their learning goals, they used different levels of abstraction. So examples of that are a student saying, I want to be a good professional who communicates well in a team, or a student saying, I want to ask for feedback after each word round. Of course, on a completely different level of abstraction. Some students realized this and described their lower level of abstraction goals as a small step towards reaching that higher ambition. Some did not. They just had mostly goals on a high level of abstraction. And students indicated a clear intervention effect, so they explained how they would not have reached their motivation for or understanding of their goals had they not been in the focus group, which you can see this student saying when talking to the moderator. Now that's the results I wanted to show you, and they've given us a lot of food for thought, I think. And of course our research questions were, what types of goals did they set and how did they set these? And regarding the types of goals they set, we see this sort of mismatch, right? They intend to improve the actionability of their dialogue, and then when the next second they're asked to set a goal, that goal is about assertiveness and giving more feedback, which at first confuses us, but makes a little bit more sense when we think about all those barriers that students were describing that were important sources in their goal-setting process. Barriers they had encountered, they expected to encounter, and you can imagine that if a student has all these barriers in mind, they might think, well, I want to improve the actionability of my dialogue, but before I can do this, I need to learn how to start one in the first place, a dialogue, that is. So should we be asking ourselves, is learning to initiate a dialogue and overcoming the barriers to that initiation, is that somehow conditional for the development of other aspects of feedback literacy? Should it come first, or maybe even instead of? And there are lots of examples, I think, in literature about students struggling to initiate a feedback dialogue look at feedback seeking or speaking up. So that prioritization might not be such a bad idea. Another thing we thought regarding the types of goals they set, we had these different levels of abstraction, right? And these hierarchical levels of goal abstraction can be found in the literature when you look at the work of Carver and Shire. So they describe how you can have higher level B goals that consist of lower level do goals. And the lower level goals are sort of the means to an end on a higher level. And for instance, a student could have the higher level goal to be more assertive in their interprofessional communication, which goes with the lower level goal to give unsought feedback to an interprofessional senior colleague. Now, you might think, okay, we have the answer. We just need to tell our students to set their goals on a lower level of abstraction. That'll make them more specific, more doable. Great, we've helped them very much. That was my first thought, at least. But maybe it's not that simple, because these students had actually been told to set SMART learning goals from year 1. They were now in year 4 and 5, so couldn't they already do that? If we look again at Carver and Shire, you see they describe students can have multiple simultaneous goals, which can be mutually exclusive. So, say for instance, this student also has the higher level goal to be safe in their learning environment. On a lower level, that might cause them to want to avoid possible conflict with those higher up in the power hierarchy. Also, a very easily imaginable goal. However, that is in direct conflict with their feedback goal. And a student could easily see this and describe this as a barrier. But should they? Or should we be explaining these experienced barriers to initiating feedback dialogue not as barriers, but as conflicting goals? And should exploring them as such with students and discussing them, could that help them, give them more agency in choosing when to act on which goal in practice? That's a thought we had. I have one more. I'm sort of looking at the time. Okay, so the final discussion point I wanted to show you. As I said, students combined certain information sources as they were talking about their goal setting. Now, the work of Nicole helps us understand that as comparisons. Comparisons yielding insights in support of their goal setting. However, Nicole also describes goals guiding those comparisons. Stay with me. So you might be confused, so goals were the outcome of the comparison, right? Not the thing guiding it. But when we look at that in light of the goal hierarchies, it actually starts making more sense. So goals on a higher level, ambitions, broad ambitions of students, guiding their comparison process as they set lower level goals. So that actually quite aligns. However, we had about 11 students out of 1,000 telling us this, so maybe we can't really make claims about the explanatory value of this model. But we might be able to draw on its instructional value. Like Nicole says, making it explicit is how we harness its power. So perhaps we should just try to replicate this in our education, which is what we're trying to do now. So we're making students explicitly discuss these sources with their peers as they set their goals, and hopefully therefore giving them a little bit more insight and motivation for their schools. So I had a discussion point, but maybe we'll get to that later. I think I'm going to wrap up now, and thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, we'll hear at the end.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for keeping well to time. That's good. So, our third paper is with Naomi Winston, and she's looking at the influence of work placements on students' feedback-related cognitions and behaviours. So, Naomi.
Thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. So the project that I'm going to share with you today is a larger project. I'm just going to talk about one part of the data. And this was an attempt to explore the role of work experience in developing and generating understanding of feedback, and also providing the opportunities to enact different types of feedback experiences to those that are commonly found within higher education. So when we think about approaches to developing feedback literacy, the literature points us towards different things that we can try in practice. There are bolt-on interventions, those that are not necessarily embedded within a formal curriculum, but might involve different workshops or sessions for students to attend to help them develop skills underpinning the use of feedback. There's also an increasing recognition of the value of activities that take place within normal class time or within the activities that students do as part of their programme as a way of further developing feedback literacy. That we can do a lot with what we already do by explaining its value in developing feedback literacy. So practices such as self-assessment, peer review, engagement with exemplars, for example, have all been framed as having value in developing student feedback literacy. And then finally, we can actually use the content of the curriculum itself to help develop students' feedback literacy. So we can talk to them about the discipline-specific concepts that they're learning about as part of their programme, to help them develop understanding and to open up discussion about feedback, what it means, what it's for, what some of the challenges are, and how we want feedback to work within a particular discipline. So all of these examples of strategies to support the development of feedback literacy are focused on the university context. They take place within the programmes that students are doing at university. But an increasing feature of higher education programmes, particularly in the UK, is the role of work placements. Sometimes these are called professional training years, sometimes they're called sandwich years. But the idea is that students do the first 2 years of their higher education course at university. They then spend a whole year working in an industry associated with their programme, and following that year they return to do the final year of their studies. So it's a full year in the workplace, sandwiched between the first and second and the final year of their programme. Now, when we think about feedback literacy, a real benefit we hope developing students' feedback literacy will have is that it will transfer into the workplace, that we will find our students better able to manage feedback processes in the workplace if we've supported them to develop feedback literacy within higher education. But there's also the potential for this transfer to work in the opposite direction when we're talking about a situation where a student is experiencing quite a substantial amount of time within the workplace as part of their higher education course. Can feedback literacy therefore then transfer from the workplace to higher education? And there's some evidence that workplace experience does influence students' feedback literacy. So the work of Christy Noble in health professions education indicates that as a result of placements, of being in the workplace and enacting that role as somebody who's more than just a student, students started to transform their understanding of feedback, reframing it from something that is done to them to something where they are agentic and where they are driving that process. So potential transfer of feedback literacy from the workplace back to university, where students have the opportunity to engage in this quite substantive work experience. So this was what we were interested in exploring in the context of UK higher education, where these placement years are quite common. And what we were interested in is how the individual's experience as an employee during their professional training year have an influence on their understanding and approach to feedback when they return to university to complete the final year of their programme. So this part of the project focuses on semi-structured interviews with a group of final year business students, all of whom had undertaken a placement. And they typically worked in areas such as marketing, recruitment, and so on. And the interview schedule explored their perceptions of both productive and unproductive feedback experiences, both at university and in the workplace, their perceptions of different roles and responsibilities in feedback, and in general their experiences of using feedback in these contexts. And so we analysed the data using inductive thematic analysis, and two broad themes I will talk through today. The first is the way in which their work placement had an influence on their feedback-related cognitions, and then the second, the influence on their feedback-related behaviours. So starting with cognitions, what we found under this theme were three sub-themes representing different ways in which students thought differently about feedback, or their thinking about feedback had been challenged as a result of their experiences in the workplace. So the first was around managing emotion, and students spoke about how previously they had found feedback quite challenging, the impact on emotion, but their experiences in the workplace had helped them to realise that it was a beneficial thing sometimes to experience an emotion in this way, and that it wasn't personal, but it's actually how you can improve, and in general shows that the work you're doing is important and of value. Another area of interest was around ipsative feedback and the importance of workplace experiences in showing to students the value of feedback that builds upon something that students have done before, which is less common in higher education to have sequences of tasks where feedback from one feeds directly into the next. But within the workplace, what students were experiencing was ongoing iterative feedback that related to the goals that they were working towards and that their line manager was helping them to develop. So feedback was constantly referenced to these goals, and they could see not only how they were doing, but how they had improved since a previous conversation, and that was incredibly motivating for them. The third area in which their cognitions developed was around the area of social presentation. Now, at university, most of their experiences of feedback had been private, in that they had received feedback in a written form, perhaps, that only they saw, or in a conversation where feedback was private and personal to them, and nobody else really had access to it. Yet suddenly in the workplace, they found themselves in meetings where the feedback was being given to them in a very public forum, in front of colleagues, in front of people that they were working with. And this enabled them to really see the role of feedback in managing other people's perceptions of you, that feedback actually helps us to understand what people think about us, and we can also use our engagement with feedback to shape the way in which people perceive us. So that public nature of feedback did help them think differently about what feedback can do. Then in terms of feedback-related behaviours, again, we've got 3 sub-themes here. The first one, taking action. So students talked about how the workplace experience had encouraged them to think differently about the importance of taking action on feedback. Rather than just saying, I realise it's important for me to use feedback, they talked about how in the workplace, the importance of them taking action was because of the stakes, not just for them, but for the other people that they were working with. And if they didn't take action on feedback, and if they didn't do what they needed to do to improve, they were going to be letting other people down rather than just themselves. And so they felt greater accountability to take steps to implement feedback. Self-evaluation was another area in which their behaviour developed, the capacity to judge the quality of what they were doing themselves. And part of this came about because the conversations that they would have with their colleagues, their line managers, their supervisors, where feedback conversations were taking place, would typically reference to those learning goals or the goals or targets that they'd been set. And so experiencing feedback in this very clear way, linked explicitly to goals and to targets, helped them to calibrate judgment and also to learn about how that can be a really beneficial part of learning through feedback. And finally, feedback seeking. So when we interviewed these students at the start of their final year, they talked a lot about how they were planning to be more proactive in going to talk to their tutors, their lecturers, to seek feedback because they'd experienced that as being really beneficial as part of their work placements. And part of that came through because during the placement, many of them experienced a formal work appraisal or performance review for the very first time. And through that, they'd learned how to ask the right questions to get the feedback on their performance that they were looking for. And so they valued this immensely and said that when they came back to university, they were going to start enacting that within the context of their studies based on their experience in the workplace. So the implications of these findings, in terms of practice, they illustrate the value of engaging in reflective activities when students return to university to undertake their final year of the programme, reflective activities that help them to draw upon those experiences from their work placement, think about what feedback meant to them in that context and how that can shape their thinking about feedback and their behaviours in the context of the higher education study. There are also implications of these findings for programmes that don't have work placements as part of the structure. There's still value in encouraging students to reflect upon other forms of work experience that they might have, so that they can still benefit from that transfer of understanding about feedback in one context to another. But there's also value then for alumni on a particular programme to come back and to share their own experiences of how their feedback time, the things that have gone on with feedback in the university context, have played out once they've been in the workplace. There were also some students within our study who'd had very negative experiences on work placements, for whom the feedback was not constructive and where they felt almost they wanted to give up the placement because of the experiences they'd had. So when we think about developing students' feedback literacy, supporting them to be able to engage with feedback in those kinds of contexts is important too. In terms of research, the longer-term impact of work placements is something that we're interested in. The data I've presented today relate to an interview with students at the start of their final year. We've collected data from them later on in the academic year to see whether these intentions of how their behaviour might change have actually played out in practice over that year. We also want to look at the effect on performance. So does this change in feedback-related behaviours actually feed through to a change in attainment, in skills, in things that the students are doing as part of their programme? And also looking beyond self-report. So thinking about other sources of data that would be valuable in addressing this question. Artefacts such as reflective logs that are being completed throughout the placement, workplace supervisor reports, and actually looking at behaviour in the final year of the study rather than just what students say they intend to do. So that's a very brief snapshot of just one part of this broader project. So I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. Well, everyone's very good at keeping to time, which means we actually have some discussion time. So that's the important bit. Right, can I introduce Bianca Maleka, who will be presenting our final paper.
Thank you, thank you. Hello everyone, and I would like to start by saying that last month I submitted my PhD thesis at Cradle Deakin, but I think I can still officially introduce myself as a PhD student. So I'm speaking as a PhD student today, and I'm excited to be here because it is my first face-to-face conference during my 3-year candidature, so really exciting to be here. The papers that we've heard today focused on the development of feedback literacy in interprofessional health context and also work placements. And our paper explores how feedback literacy capabilities can be fostered through the design of ipsative strategies in coursework. The paper I'll be talking about today was written in collaboration with Rola Ajawi, David Bowd, and Joanna Tai, who are my PhD supervisors, and it was published last year in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. This is the second paper that makes up my PhD on the role of ipsative feedback processes in developing feedback literacy. We know from the feedback research that if students are to take action on feedback, scaffolded feedback designs are needed. Such designs create opportunities for students to seek and offer feedback. They are designed in a way to require follow-up from the students, and they build students' capacity for evaluative judgment, which is defined as the capability to make decisions about the quality of own work. And empirical research tells us that sequenced tasks, such as multi-staged assessments, interlinked tasks, or draft and redraft designs, promote feedback dialogue and encourage students to process and use of feedback. And these practices, we also know, and we've heard in the keynote today, it's important that they are discipline-specific. And we were interested in looking at a rather underexplored feedback strategy called ipsative feedback. And in educational context, ipsative feedback refers to a comparison of a student's current work with a previous one on a similar task. And much of what we know about ipsative feedback comes from the research into ipsative assessment by Hughes. So it was really important, firstly, to think about and conceptualize ipsative processes within the new paradigm of feedback, which is understood as the process where both teacher and student have responsibilities. So in our first paper, we define ipsative feedback as learner-centered feedback processes organized across multiple tasks with similar learning outcomes. So the element of a strict, if you will, design is implied in ipsative. So the research question was how can ipsative feedback design improve student action from feedback? And the research was conducted at direct entry program at an English language center affiliated with the university. The purpose of DEP is to prepare international students for their tertiary studies in Australia. So students who are doing a direct entry program have conditional offers from the university, and upon successful completion of the course, they move to a variety of postgraduate or undergraduate studies. And this course is heavily focused on developing academic writing skills and includes 6 hours of writing practice, writing skills, writing workshop. We had 10 participants of Chinese nationality, and as you can see here, 9 were continuing on to postgraduate studies and 1 undergraduate study. And as the research took place during the pandemic, 8 of the participants completed the course online. The study was set within the design-based research, and this approach was adopted because the study was set within a real educational context, and it looked at solving a problem that is critical to learning. And we also needed a design that would include the cycles of iterative development and implementation of intervention, and also that would be responsive to real-time changes in students' perceptions and uptake of feedback processes. And the studies that follow DBR usually have 3 stages. So the first one is the analysis of a practical problem. So in our case is the lack of student action on feedback, and the development of intervention, the ipsative feedback design. The second stage involved 3 cycles of the testing and implementation of intervention. And the last stage was the reflection to enhance intervention implementation. And we chose ePortfolio as a tool to implement ipsative feedback processes. And the ePortfolio was designed for its affordances for its structural affordances, that is the ability to collate student work and feedback and provide student easy access, both students and the teacher, easy access to past tasks. We also the e-portfolio included a number of points of engagement from students, which were the learning goals, systematic reflection and peer feedback, and finally teacher action, so teacher comments that focused on incremental progress from task to task to provide that personalized feedback. And we conducted semi-structured interviews and analyzed student e-portfolios, their artifacts, and also looked at teachers' field notes. And data analysis involved thematic analysis of interviews and artifacts. And so I would like to talk about the findings now, and I would like to highlight 4 effects of ipsative feedback design. The first one relates to prompting comparisons against a range of reference. So the key feature of ipsative feedback is a comparison of 2 or more samples of student work. In this intensive course, such a comparison was initially undertaken by a teacher who would frame comments in relation to the standards for a particular task and also individual students' learning goals. And as comparisons are inherent in ipsative design, they encourage the learners to make them systematically. And the participants reported frequent reading of previous work and also looking back at their previous feedback, looking at the goals from the preceding week and these goals then being guided in the formation of new goals, and also looking at the work of their peers and the feedback that the peers received. That is the first effect. The second effect was that the feedback design encouraged monitoring and evaluation of learning. And since the comments focused on improvements or the lack between tasks, when students were reading comments framed in this way, they could see in which areas they improved and which areas they were still lacking. So they themselves were looking for evidence of progress. And as you can read in this one quote here from a student who said that the number of subject-verb agreement or wrong word errors has reduced from week to week. So it seems that what ipsative feedback design offers is that clear articulation of how the performance has been enhanced since the previous task. The third effect is supporting the scaffolding of feedback processes. And the ipsative feedback design with the loops of feedback and systematic reflection and action supported that scaffolding. And I've mentioned that in the initial stages, these comments were generated by the teacher, but in the final stages of the course, the peers had an opportunity to provide that comments as well. And finally, the design builds learners' feedback histories. So much of learning is context dependent, and learners co-construct their new understandings. And we found from a few participants that as they finished the course and moved to the next course, they continued to use ePortfolio. They continued rewriting. They continued looking and working together with peers, even though that was not a requirement of the course. This was a very reassuring finding, because it shows that if students, when students develop habits that they find productive to their own learning, they are likely to continue, and especially if they move to their environments that are perhaps impoverished in terms of the feedback design. In terms of the implications, I would like to talk about, and I would like to frame them with thinking about developing student feedback literacy through feedback design. So the first implication is because comparisons were so crucial in our research, we call for the inclusion of comparison processes in the curriculum. And so that means designing tasks with explicit comparisons, where students are asked to use different reference. They could be their own work, could be exemplars, rubrics, learning goals, in order to help them learn. And these processes should be initially modeled by a teacher. It's not that straightforward to compare your performance, especially if you want to frame it within the standards for a particular task. So modeling by a teacher initially, before then teaching students the skills of comparison making, seeing improvements, seeing similarities, so that they can do it on their own. And the implementation of recursive and iterative cycles of ipsative feedback, especially in undergraduate or first-year programs. So these can be facilitated by peers, and they also, the efficiency could be increased through audio or video tools for feedback. So there are some exciting further study directions in this area. Taking a closer look at comparison-making processes by exploring cognitive and affective processes. Some of this work is done by Nicole, but there's exciting new projects that can follow that. And also seeing how ipsative feedback can be implemented in larger classes and what affordances are needed to implement it on a larger scale. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Well, we're doing very well for keeping it. Yep. I'm not sure how to blank the screen, but
Just ignore it.
so I'd like to introduce Rochelle Esterhazy, who will be our discussant. And following Rochelle's comments, I'd like to invite the presenters up to the front, and maybe also including Anastasia, for open discussion.
All right.
Rochelle.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a really exciting opportunity, and as you said, this is really kind of an exciting symposium to be in, because this is a concept that has been emerging, growing, branching out, new empirical work, and feedback literacy is really kind of a hot topic in our community at the moment. So that's a lot of fun to be discussing this today. I've been asked not to linger too long on the different papers, so I'm just going to try to comment a little bit on all the four of you, your papers, which I really liked. Have a couple of open questions, and then some ideas also for how to move forward in the field. So I'm going to start with Dave's presentation in the beginning, the feedback literacy scale paper. I think that's, of course, a very timely development of such a tool that will be very useful for the further empirical work that hopefully will also emerge in the different community parts that are working with feedback literacy. And it's nice that this is quite a solid way of developing such a scale, working with experts and validating it. Some things that I was thinking about when I was reading the paper that you sent me up front is that, of course, you're using the conceptualization that you have yourself developed. But when I was also reading your, the Westerveld framework, it was like there are actually some aspects that are maybe relevant to consider also that have something to do with this open and respectful way of communicating that are maybe not as present in the dimension that you are using. So I think there's still some ways of cross-fertilizing, as we heard this morning, of ideas, because I think the concept, even though it has quite some conceptual work has been done on it, I think it's still not quite readily matured. So I think that there are some really nice cross-fertilizations possible. Another thing that I'm not sure if you will have that in your final paper, I was very curious to know more about why certain items were actually excluded by the experts, because that was mentioned in the paper at least. So what were the items that the expert couldn't agree on maybe? So that is a very interesting information, I would think. And I had some thoughts about the context dependency of the scale, because the ambition, if I understood correctly, is of course to have a more generic scale that can be used across contexts. And well, that is of course useful, but also to question a little bit how meaningful is it to measure feedback literacy in such a generic way, because maybe part of such a literacy is also for students to be actually able to adapt to the context and to understand, well, am I using the feedback in this context, but maybe in another one I'm going to act in a very different way. So maybe to think about how can you actually include such a context dependency in such a scale. I'm not sure if I have an answer for that, but that I would be very curious to see an approach like that. And I was thinking, I know that you use the Big Five personality scale for external validation. I understood that today in the presentation. But it made me think, what kind of message does that send to students if we think about that feedback literacy is kind of an expression of our personality? And I would maybe doubt that and say that it's actually more of something that we do and not something that we are. Right. So just a challenging comment that you can think about. Okay, moving on to not to linger too long, to the next paper by was Renke and what's your name again? Claudia. Yeah, sorry. I liked it very much. One of those papers that use an empirical approach now, and there are more and more papers like this coming up, so I really enjoy that. I'm reading them all. And I think especially this field, interprofessional healthcare, that's really one of those fields where you can see this is where feedback really can be about life and death. So if you are not good in giving feedback and receiving feedback, you might make some issues and make some errors and someone might die. So I think that's really an exciting field to look into feedback. So I really like also again these 7 criteria that you were using. And again, actually then linking back to Dave's and Anastasia's paper, there was some dimension that I thought was maybe underrepresented in. That was the managing affect and emotion dimension. I was kind of missing that because I would think that would be important as well for them to kind of manage their emotions that might come up in these situations. So I think that might be something that would be interesting to look at. Yes, and another thing that struck me as interesting is this focus on the learning goals, on setting learning goals for the feedback, for developing your feedback literacy in this case. And I was wondering about this ability to set your own goals, whether that is actually a requirement or a result of being feedback literate. So it seems to be kind of like a new concept that is kind of coming up as something that is very important when it comes to feedback literacy, but I wonder what comes first. Is it this ability to be able to be goal determined that is relevant for the feedback literacy, or do you first need to understand how to work with feedback in order to be able to set your own goals? So that actually links a little bit also to what you've been working on, because you also have the learning goals like Bianca as a very core focus in your paper. So I like that very much. Kind of a new line of thought in a way that comes in there. Yes, and Naomi, moving on to your paper, again, also I really like that there's like a more empirical work on the topic, and the workplace, as in your case, something very relevant where we need feedback, where we need to work with feedback, but I like the twist that you're kind of saying, well, what they're actually experiencing in the work placement, how does that influence you in the university context then, when you are then continue working with feedback. So I thought that was a really nice approach. But one thing that I kept thinking all the time when I was reading and now also listening is this, it seems that this work experience, or you're assuming, is contributing to a development of feedback literacy, but maybe it is also just a general maturation process that happens when you start working, when you start being out there in the real life, and then you come back and you have a completely different perspective on things suddenly. So does that mean that becoming more mature also automatically means becoming more feedback literate, or are these two processes that can be actually separated from each other and can be studied individually from each other? So I think that was a very interesting thing that kept coming up for me. And actually you mentioned it today because one of my questions was also whether there was evidence of bad experiences that actually impeded on the students' development of their feedback literacy, and you've mentioned yes, there was. So that would be maybe something to explore also further. Okay, so final paper by Bianca. Well, again, congratulations for handing in. That's really great. Great set of papers that you have there. I recommend everyone to read this because it's a very important way of approaching feedback literacy as something that we as teachers actually can do by designing and planning our curricula. So that I think that's a very important approach. And I think it shows such a nice link between teacher feedback literacy and student feedback literacy, because as a teacher, if you are feedback literate and you know how to design your course and how to create iterative feedback loops, that will most likely also then impact on your students' abilities to work with feedback. So I think that was a very nice example. What I particularly liked is also this temporal aspect of your study, because you have the students over a long time and they have like all these loops of feedback that they go through. And I was wondering whether you could think about when was actually the moment, or when are the moments where the students shift their focus from seeing feedback as only the responsibility of the teacher giving feedback to them to actually seeing it as a kind of a co-responsibility, where they themselves start kind of exploring and saying, hey, this is something I can do on my own and I can just get feedback from other sources. So it would be, from my perspective, very interesting to kind of try to track that. Where's the moment where that actually happens in such a course? Yes, and then I was wondering, I think you said that this would be something that also first-year students could be doing, but whether that is actually a type of curriculum, a type of program where you actually need a certain basic feedback literacy in order to be able to engage with such a quite complex feedback design. So maybe something that you can comment on later on if we have time in the discussion. And now I just wanted to say two ideas that I had after being very inspired by all your papers and reading them, of how we could also move forward, especially in the empirical work with, on feedback literacy. And one was that I was thinking it would be really interesting to have more empirical studies on where we try to identify really the crucial moments where students start acting feedback literate. And to identify these moments and then to zoom into these and to understand what is actually happening in these moments. What do the students do, say, what do they work with, what are the teachers doing, to kind of like really unpack these moments. And then, of course, in the next step to think about how can we recreate such moments in our curricula? What are actually the make or break moments that help the students to actually productively then engage with the feedback? And the other point was just one more thing, is that if we think about feedback and using feedback, not using feedback is sometimes also part of being feedback literate. So to explore a little bit further when students consciously decide not to use feedback and how that is actually just as important to understand maybe as an academic or as a professional than always just having to say, yes, okay, I will implement that comment. So I think that is another way forward. Thank you for staying with me, and I hope there's more time for other discussions.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. That's focused our discussion wonderfully. Yep. There's probably one seat fewer. I understand. Oh, I think we're almost. We have the right number of seats. Yeah, you sure? Right, we can divide it in. Rather than ask the panel to respond to the discussion, I'd like to kind of give you an opportunity first to make any comments, raise any questions. We've got about 20 minutes, almost 20 minutes, and we think, yes. Please speak loudly.
Great symposium. I hope you love that. I got a question to you, Philip. So you included affect management as one dimension in your instrument. I think that's fantastic. It's a dimension that has been neglected for quite a while, right, in the field. And emotions are, I would say, are critically important. I mean, if you are annoyed or frustrated, you are not in a good position to make productive use of feedback. And similarly, if you are anxious or ashamed, I mean, and the long-term motivation consequence can be just devastated. Now, managing emotions is a pretty complex process, and if you look into models of emotional regulation, James Ross's model, for example, I mean, it's complex, a set of strategies. How did you conceptualize affect management, or would you want to conceptualize it in a feedback context? I mean, you got 5 items, so it must have been some.
Yes, I mean, that's a much bigger question than the instrument, and how we as teachers support that. I mean, I think we have to focus on what students actually express, and I think the ways in which we might intervene might vary enormously from the health context in which people are actually, working in real health system settings with real people, as distinct from students who are kind of in isolation from that. So I'm going to approach the article and say we need a variety of approaches to do this, but we need to encourage teachers to see that as part of their repertoire of the students, because we do know that the emotional responses that students have to feedback information can significantly get in the way of engaging with what is instigated.
Hi, great. I'm not sure if this is kosher, Dave, but what I wanted to ask the panel was to respond to Michelle's last prompt, to ask you, if you had to say what were the critical moments, the critical feedback moments that built feedback literacy through the work that you've done, what would they be?
Who wants to start?
I think I can start. For me, those were all in practice for these students. So the students in our study had already had some internship experience and were turning to practice. So I think that really aligns with what Naomi was saying. So certain experiences with emotions, with receiving feedback, with giving feedback, the struggles they had and the strategies they developed. I think they were all in practice.
I think that in my case, for me, a relatively clear articulation came when students moved to a different course that was that had a very different design, and they started using the strategies that they'd learned in the previous course. So for me, that is an articulation of feedback literacy. They've learned the skills. They continued with taking action. They built their own network of peer support students. So it's difficult to say. We did many things. Which one of those things really had an impact, I don't know. It's a different study itself. But the evidence that they continued with the strategies for me is an articulation that they've developed some sort of feedback literacy.
Yeah, I think there's real value in moments that promote perspective taking. If you're in the same experience all the time and the feedback exchanges are very similar all the time, you don't get the opportunity to really step back and think, oh, what's going on there? Something might be different. So something that takes students out of the everyday, ordinary approaches to feedback that they experience to make them look critically at what's going on, I think is really important in
then to go to the our presenters. I might be able to say with the first shot, because you haven't spoken yet. Is there anything that you want to pick up from what the discussant, Michelle, has mentioned that you think you want to respond to? Or are there other issues that you've come up with, having heard the other people in the symposium?
Absolutely. First of all, I apologize for tardiness. And second of all, I would like to comment both on what David mentioned, what Michelle mentioned as well. So I joined this project as a methodologist. So I come from a methods, measurement perspective. So I did network of the fellowship in education and testing service. So my role here, along with Yan Zi, was to do this confirmatory factor analysis and make sure that the scale is working properly. So the reason for including the big five, right? So we, in the field of education and psychology, we have an issue with the jingle-jangle fallacy. All of you probably are familiar with it when we introduce new constructs and then call them something else, but then they get subsumed under the construct that we already have, or we name identical constructs with different, which one is jingle, which one is jangle. So our role with the inclusion of Big Five was to make sure that first of all we have some differential discriminant validity evidence so that we look at the correlations between the factors of the feedback literacy scale with the Big Five personality dimensions. And in our case it was a great idea to include the scale into our study, because we had two factors, as David mentioned, two factors that were very highly correlated. And normally, we would collect those two factors and not include them as two separate ones because they're measuring the same thing. But in our case, conceptually, we made an argument, we argued and thought about it a lot, and we kept them in the scale. And then after looking at correlations with the Big Five personality dimensions, we noted the correlations are differential. So this is just an extra support for why we're keeping these two factors in the scale. This is one. Number two, Rachel. So we are in no way suggesting that feedback literacy is a stable dimension. And what David mentioned, that personality is not intervenable, I vehemently disagree with this statement. Because, again, working at ETS and I come also from the clinical side, so we currently run a lot of studies in which we develop interventions of personality, of the Big Five personality factors, especially facets of the Big Five personality factors. So I apologize for my tardiness. So this is time management, which is a facet of conscientiousness. So I assure you it's very much intervenable, and normally I don't do that. So again, personality can change and we can design interventions to change it, and with the literacy, we are not suggesting that it's something stable and it's something that cannot be.
Anyone else in the panel have something?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on Michelle's point about not using feedback as being a really important outcome. And this was a theme that was also discussed at the Supplement in Higher Education Conference in Manchester last week. And I think it's really important because we assume that the student who has well-developed feedback literacy will be enacting and implementing comments. And indeed, a lot of the studies and methods for looking at the use of feedback look for evidence of change in terms of comparing, let's say, a draft and a second piece of work. And that's a problem then, if actually not using feedback as part of the sense-making process that is involved in feedback reception. Anastasia and I have an early emerging field group which is titled The Black Box of Feedback, because what we're looking at is that crucial question of what happens next, and trying to uncover some of the cognitive processing of feedback information that tells us what actually goes on and what can we learn from that. And if we think about that processing journey from initial engagement with comments right through to what might look like an action, there's a really important part of that process, which is decision making and reasoned decision making that either results in an action or results in perhaps stepping back from an action. And that's something that I think as a field we need to know a lot more about, because it is valid to argue that not using feedback
even when he doesn't learn it.
Thank you, Rochelle, for your comments, and I would like to pick up your second question, I believe, which was about implementing IPSIT feedback in first-year students. So the IPSIT feedback is a tight feedback design, but I think precisely for that reason, I think it would work very well with students who are just starting their, at the beginning of the trajectory. So my students were even before they were direct entry program students, and they coped very well with the number of activities they were asked to do, whether that was setting their learning goals, whether that was providing peer feedback, or rewriting work, or action planning. I think from us as teachers, designers, it does require rethinking how we structure our tasks. But I think by structuring them in a tighter way, where we see the scaffolding from one task, or looking at the assessments that are scaffolded, we are supporting students. And I think from when students move on, those scaffolds could be released, and they would, because they would have had the skills, and they would have developed the feedback literacy, not to rely on the scaffold. So I think relying on those feedback scaffolds is actually quite productive for first-year students.
Yeah, it's not like a concrete answer, I guess, to what you were saying, but more I share with you that I feel like we're not like there yet, with the feedback literacy concept and fully grasping it. And today's session made me think also your presentation, Naomi, which it was also about the work placement. It's relatable to the context that we in the medical center study, because for us the impetus for looking to feedback is not the frustration of students not using their comments, but because we think feedback skills are very crucial for them as professionals. But their goals are quite different from the goals that they have in our programs. But still, in these programs, we want to prepare them for what's expected from them in the workplace. And now maybe that's one of the things that at least I haven't disentangled yet, or didn't realize before as much as I do now, that prevents me from really understanding what is the feedback literacy something that we need within our programs? Is it an outcome? And it's very relatable to the very valid point that you make of goals being the start, being the outcome, being the means to an end. Are they the end? I feel like there's more work to be done, and I hope also in the sessions upcoming, I saw feedback literacy and other titles too, that continuing this discussion with each other really helps us to bring more focus and center to the next steps.
Yeah, so the what comes first thing is something we constantly struggle with. So most research is on, for instance, self-regulation versus feedback literacy. You need to be feedback literacy for your self-regulation, but we're looking at self-regulation of feedback literacy. And the same with agencies. There's a lot of work being done about agency and feedback literacy, agency in the feedback process, but what about being agentic when choosing to develop your literacy? And I think definitely you need, so one of the most important sources students were using in the development of their literacy skills was their previous workplace rotation, so you couldn't do this with first-year students. So we're struggling with that, both in our work and practice, research work and practice, yeah.
We've got a few more minutes for other questions, so can I put up again, one here and
Yes, I would like to know about the use of technologies. I would assume that many of these research have been conducted in the last 2 to 3 years, and if at some point the feedback that has been provided and examined has been mainly oral, or has been also used with videos, audios, with the technology has involved in your studies and the results.
so anybody want to comment on the kind of the changes that might have occurred in the COVID times?
So, technology was crucial for my project because I used ePortfolio, and my research started before COVID, when I had students in the classroom, but the ePortfolio was designed using online tools, So what that meant was that when the second cycle happened during COVID, we did not have to make any adjustments because the tool and the tool was already there, and for Ipsative, I cannot imagine not using technology. You need to have access to past work, you need to have access to past feedback. So any kinds of platforms that allow you to design e-portfolios or whatever other way you would like to implement it, I think are crucial.
Good educational designs are often quite robust and can translate into different environments. I think the question is, are there new things we've learned through COVID? And I think it's an open question at the moment. I think the studies are still in the middle of being done. Maybe. Yes, question.
I actually have the same question when looking at my results. So is this something that is specific to the interprofessional context? Are our results only usable there? Or is it broader than that? So I'm very interested to see.
I think it would also be a very interesting empirical question, because I was thinking about the feedback literacy scale. I thought that would be very interesting to ask students, if I think about our context, whether their answers to those questions would differ with colleagues in a mono-professional setting, or with colleagues from another profession, because based on our findings, we would expect that they would then give different answers, because there's more barriers for competing goals, for engaging in feedback dialogues in the first place. But maybe
although the framework grew mainly on the first feedback literacy conceptualization, the Malloy paper is the one that enables to operationalise it more. And the Malloy paper was based upon an analysis of a very large data set right across all the disciplines that were represented in the two universities. Now, when you do that, you're probably going to see the dominant practices give more emphasis than those which are small, like professional learning is probably going to come up at a small level of that. We deliberately drew upon its wide database so that we weren't loading it in a disciplinary way unconsciously. So I think there's a long way to go. We do this with the professional context, with the workplace context, etc.
I think very good point, which is we're still talking here about feedback literacy as a singular construct, whereas there are likely multiple feedback literacies, and I could have very well-developed feedback literacy in one domain, but we actually be quite limited in our capacity to implement feedback in another, and disciplines and the interaction between different contexts, all of these factors lead us to, I think, move towards multiple feedback literacies rather than a single point that we get to and suddenly we're there.
And on that point, I'd like to draw might be out there. So I'd like to thank our panel and our contributor paper. Thank you very much.